specific dye. That dye gets taken up specifically by the neurons in the brain that manufacture dopamine. Then they were able to image the brains of those people while those people were wide awake using something called positron emission tomography. Again, the specific tool isn't necessarily important, but since some of you like to know. And what they found is that for people that had a high working memory span, that is, could remember long strings of numbers or letters or other information, they tended to be the people that had more dopamine available for release in the frontal cortex, either because they had more of the dopamine neurons themselves or similar number of neurons, but those neurons had more dopamine to release, okay? And they also found the converse. Individuals that had a low working memory span and ability had less dopamine available for release. So that establishes a correlation, but it's not causal. A different study, which is also a classic, was carried out by Brzozowski, Brown, Rosvold, and Goldman. And this is a really important study because in this study, they were able to introduce small amounts of dopamine directly into the cortex and evaluate working memory capacity. Now, anytime a working memory test is done, the same pattern always emerges. This is regardless of any dopamine being infused into the brain, which is people and animals for that matter are very good at remembering short spans of numbers, letters, or other types of information. So if you tell them one thing, like the letter A, and then you ask them, do you remember the letter? Almost everybody remembers that. But if you give them a string of 10 letters, they remember fewer of those 10 letters. That's sort of obvious, but it's an important point to emphasize nonetheless. And so there's a kind of a dropping off curve of performance as one progresses from fewer to greater number of items to be remembered. In this study, when dopamine was introduced to the frontal cortex, the number of things that individuals could remember simply increased. It was a very straightforward result. More dopamine introduced allowed longer letter, number, and information strings to be remembered. And of course, forgotten, because that's what working memory involves. Remembering and then discarding of information shortly thereafter. Now, the findings that I just described complement what I said before, which is the naturally occurring experiment. Bring people into the lab, measure their working memory span, look at how much dopamine they make. Higher dopamine, better working memory. Lower dopamine, lower working memory. The experiment I just described was one in which dopamine is introduced, showing that dopamine is very likely the rate limiting or the capacity limiting, it's probably the better way to put it, the capacity limiting neuromodulator for improving working memory. That's a fancy nerd speak way of saying more dopamine allows for better working memory. But a critical feature of this experiment is that they did a number of experiments where they didn't introduce dopamine, but instead they introduced other neuromodulators to the prefrontal cortex, such as norepinephrine or serotonin. And the interesting finding is that the addition of norepinephrine or serotonin, which of course are other neuromodulators that can change the firing patterns of neurons in the prefrontal cortex, but elsewhere as well, it's just that in this case they were added to the prefrontal cortex, had no effect on working memory. It neither improved nor degraded working memory when those neuromodulators were introduced. In other words, dopamine, and perhaps only dopamine, seems to be the dominant neuromodulator for regulating the degree, that is, whether or not you have small, medium, or large amounts of working memory capacity in the prefrontal cortex. And of course, there have been a bunch of other experiments that are worth mentioning briefly in this context, such as taking people that have a high working memory capacity and indeed have their brains imaged, and one sees that they have high levels of baseline dopamine, especially the dopamine projecting to the prefrontal cortex, and then they're given a drug that depletes dopamine within the prefrontal cortex, and their performance drops. And so what's so nice about the literature around working memory is that while I'm not covering all of that literature exhaustively, it all tends to jive. It all points in a direction whereby the levels of dopamine being released in the prefrontal cortex during working memory tasks correlates very strongly with capacity to perform working memory tasks. Lower dopamine, lower working memory span, as it's called. Higher dopamine, higher working memory span. Okay, so next we're going to do another working memory task, different than the one we did earlier. And we're going to do that with a specific purpose in mind, which is for you to be able to determine what your working memory capacity is, and by extension, your baseline levels of dopamine or at least the levels of dopamine that are likely being released into your prefrontal cortex while you do these working memory tasks. In other words, we're going to try and figure out whether or not you are of the low, medium, or high working memory capacity. And of course, we're doing that in part to try and establish whether or not you likely have low, medium, or high amounts of dopamine available for release in the prefrontal cortex. Now, of course, we're not putting you into a positron emission tomography scanning device. We aren't able to do that for obvious reasons. But keep in mind that what we are about to do is very similar and in some cases identical to laboratory studies where the researchers were trying to determine what people's levels of dopamine within these particular neural networks we've been discussing, the mesocortical pathway, are likely to be. In other words, performance on the working memory task that we are about to do is a decent indication of what the dopamine levels that are available for release in your prefrontal cortex perhaps might be. Now, I say perhaps might be because I don't want to cause any unnecessary alarm if, for instance, you fall into the low working memory span group. In fact, if you fall into the low working memory span group, there are actually some terrific tools that you can use to improve dopamine transmission in those pathways and improve your working memory. I also don't want people to get the impression that somehow performance on this working memory task is reflective of some larger dopamine issue in the brain. And certainly it is not, I repeat, it is not diagnostic of Parkinson's or any kind of neurodegenerative condition. Although I will say that deficits in working memory are common in patients with Parkinson's for obvious reasons. Those patients have deficits in dopamine neurons, not only production, but the number of dopamine neurons. It's one of the hallmark features of Parkinson's, but also in things like traumatic brain injury, et cetera. But the working memory task that you're about to take, when given to a general population or a group of undergraduates or so-called normals or typical control subjects, which all of you are, okay? So unless you're dealing with a traumatic brain injury or you have Parkinson's, we know that the data that you're going to get back right now is very similar to the data that people get back when they do these sorts of studies in a laboratory. That is, it's typical for some people to have a short working memory span, some people to have a medium working memory span, and some people to have a high working memory span. And today we're actually just going to divide into two bins, short working memory span and high working memory span. And we can have some degree of confidence that correlates with the amount of dopamine available for release in the frontal cortex. But, and this is a very important point, as we progress along this discussion of working memory, the neural circuits, dopamine, et cetera, I want to make clear something that I said earlier, which is that it is not the case that increasing the amount of dopamine that's available always increases working memory span. In fact, there's a common circumstance whereby people with a relatively high degree of working memory capacity increase their dopamine levels even further using pharmacology or other methods that we'll discuss, and their performance actually can degrade, okay? So if any of that is confusing now, we'll make it all very simple going forward so that if you decide to implement any of the protocols discussed in this episode, that you are aware of what you can expect and whether or not you are in the category of people that should or perhaps should not incorporate those protocols. Okay, let's test your working memory again. This time, the working memory task is going to be a little bit different than the one you did previously. This working memory task involves me reading 6 different sentences to you. And your job is to pay attention to these 6 sentences because you're going to be asked some information about these sentences in a few moments. The first sentence is, real estate costs are going up. The second sentence is, the Atlantic Ocean is warm in summer. The third sentence is, there's a lot of interest now in electric cars. The fourth sentence is, some reptiles eat only once a year. The fifth sentence is, kids nowadays look at screens more than 60% of their waking life. And the sixth and final sentence is, football can mean different sports depending on the country. Okay, so I read you 6 sentences. They were moderately long, I confess. Your job for the working memory task is now to recall as many of the final words of each of those sentences as you can. I'll give you a few moments to do that. Now, before I tell you what the final word of each of those sentences actually is, I want to remind everybody that working memory capacity follows a normal distribution. So some of you will be able to remember the final word of perhaps 5 or even 6 of those sentences, although I must say that is exceedingly rare. Some of you are going to be able to remember 3 to 4 of the final words of those sentences. And that's more typical. That actually represents the average, or the mean, as we call it. And then fewer people, although still many of you, will only be able to remember one or two of the final words of those sentences. Okay, so now I'm assuming that most of you have tried to call to memory the final word of as many of those 6 sentences as you can. And maybe you've written them down, or you've typed them into your phone, or you have some record of what you recall those 6 final words of those sentences are. Now I'm going to tell you the actual final word of each of those sentences. The final word of the first sentence was up, because as you may recall, the sentence was real estate costs are going up. The final word of the second sentence was summer, because the sentence was the Atlantic Ocean is warm in summer. The final word of the third sentence was cars, because the sentence was there is a lot of interest in electric cars. The final word of the fourth sentence was year, because the sentence was some reptiles eat only once a year. The final word of the fifth sentence was life, because the sentence was kids nowadays look at screens more than 60% of their waking life. And the final word of the sixth sentence was country, because the sentence was football can mean different sports depending on the country. Okay, so be honest with yourself and tell yourself, and you don't have to tell anyone else if you don't want to, how many of the final words of those 6 sentences you could remember correctly. It's important that you remember them correctly. Again, the number of words that you can recall, that is your working memory span, is going to vary from person to person. But we can take the normal distribution of those scores and sort of draw a line down the middle and say that if you could remember 3 to 6 of the final words of those sentences correctly, you're going to fall into the high working memory span group. Whereas if you could only remember 1 or 2 or maybe 0 of the final words of those 6 sentences, then you're going to be in the low working memory span group. Again, I don't want to alarm anybody. This doesn't mean that you have any global memory deficits or dopamine deficits, but it is important, especially if you plan to apply any of the protocols to improve working memory, that you faithfully, that is, you accurately report your working memory performance, at least to yourself. Now, as you recall, whether or not you have low or high, and here we are just binning into low and high, there's no medium. We've divided right at that line. We're saying if you can remember 3 to 6, we're calling that high working memory span, at least for this discussion. And if you can remember fewer than 3, even down to 0 of the final words of those sentences, that's low working memory span. We're dividing it in 2. We've divided you into 2 groups. And we do know when this has been done in large numbers of human subjects, and in some cases, all of those subjects have their brains imaged for the amount of dopamine available for release in their prefrontal cortex, that short working memory span correlates with lower amounts of dopamine, whereas higher working memory span or longer working memory span, whatever you want to call it, correlates with more dopamine available for release in the prefrontal cortex. Now, this is where things get really interesting and frankly, really exciting for everybody, especially the folks in the low working memory span group. Work from Marta Esposito and colleagues at UC Berkeley, as well as other laboratories, have explored the consequences of increasing dopamine levels in the brain of typical populations of individuals. So these are not people with Parkinson's or TBI, but undergraduate students, which we do realize is not completely representative of the quote unquote normal population outside the university, but also people from the community, so people who are not university students and so on. And the ways that they've increased dopamine in those individuals have tended to rely on pharmacology. So these are prescription drugs that most often have been developed for the treatment of Parkinson's in order to increase dopamine levels, but for some other purposes as well. Drugs like bromocriptine, which we know are so-called dopamine agonists. An agonist is a drug that has the consequence of increasing the amount of a given neurochemical, in this case, dopamine, whereas an antagonist is a drug that either blocks or prevents or somehow lowers the total available amount of a certain chemical, such as dopamine or serotonin, et cetera. So bromocriptine is a drug that increases dopamine. So when human subjects came into a laboratory, didn't take any drug, no bromocriptine yet, and of course, they were being evaluated for whether or not they were taking any meds for ADHD, their caffeine consumption, et cetera. There were certain rule-ins and rule-outs for that study. But certainly people that were taking any kind of prescription medication for ADHD were not included in the study or were eliminated from the study because those drugs can indeed increase dopamine as well as some other neuromodulators such as norepinephrine and epinephrine. I covered all that in the 2 ADHD episodes that I did, which again, you can find at hubermanlab.com. Just go to the search function, put in ADHD. In any event, in these studies, they took people that had not taken any drugs to increase dopamine, had their working memory measured, very similarly to the way that you measured your working memory a few minutes ago with the 6-sentence business that we did. And then they took bromocriptine, and they either took a low, a moderate, or high dose of bromocriptine. And 90 minutes later, they took a working memory task. And what was observed was very interesting. You can probably predict what it is based on everything I've said up until now. Individuals that initially had low baseline levels of dopamine and therefore shorter working memory span, so they only remembered 0 to about 3 of the final words of that 6-sentence series, their performance significantly improved. They were able to remember 4 and in some cases up to 6 of the final words of those sentences. Now, that is in complete agreement with everything we said up until now. Simply says that dopamine is important for working memory. If you start off with lower dopamine stores or dopamine availability for release in the prefrontal cortex, lower working memory performance, increased dopamine through ingestion of bromocriptine, which is this dopamine agonist. All of the circuit changes that we want and would expect to improve working memory occur, and indeed working memory improves. Okay, very straightforward. That's interesting, but the even more interesting part of the study is that individuals that already had high working memory span, when they took bromocriptine at a low or a moderate dose, their working memory did not increase further. Now, if somebody was already getting 6 of the final words of those 6 sentences, well then of course they couldn't improve their performance anymore. But many of the people in the high working memory span group, of course, only remembered 4, in some cases 3. Typically, it would be 4, 5, or 6 of the final words of those sentences. When they took bromocriptine at low or moderate doses, their working memory did not improve significantly. There was either no change or a very modest change. And here's where things get really interesting. When individuals who already had a high working memory span took the highest dose of bromocriptine, and by the way, studies verified that the amount of dopamine available indeed increased, so that was important to do, and they did that. Well, their working memory performance actually decreased, such that now they had a short or a low working memory span. So what this tells us is that the relationship between dopamine and working memory follows an inverted U-shaped function. So imagine a U and then just flip it over, meaning if you have low dopamine availability in the prefrontal cortex, working memory span is short. As you increase that amount, working memory becomes greater, but if you increase the amount of dopamine in the prefrontal cortex too much, working memory span actually drops significantly below the baseline that you started with. Now, this is important for a number of reasons, not the least of which is the known relationship between working memory and attention. Now, this is very important to understand in the context of ADHD, but also for people who don't have ADHD and are struggling to maintain focus and attention and carry out working memory tasks throughout their normal everyday life, not in the laboratory, but just moving through life. Because these days we hear a lot about people struggling with focus and attention. Perhaps, we don't know, perhaps in part due to overuse of smartphones, social media, et cetera, although there's not yet a direct causal relationship that's been established. The data that are emerging suggests that indeed overuse of those things can cause problems, but regardless of the source, there does seem to be more ADHD both in kids and in adults and subclinical challenges in focus and attention. And here's where things get really interesting as it relates to the neural circuitry. Work from Desposito and colleagues and other laboratories as well have shown, using the similar paradigm that I described before, of giving people drugs to increase their baseline levels of dopamine above their initial starting point of short or long-term memory span capacity, and then had people perform different types of working memory tasks that tap into 2 different aspects of attention and working memory. Up until now, we've been talking about working memory. It's kind of just one thing. But working memory actually involves 2 things, or at least 2 things. The first is that in order to carry out a working memory task and to attend to something, to really focus, we need the ability to rule out distractors. We need to be able to not pay attention to things that would otherwise distract us. In addition to that, we need to be able to switch from one context to the next, right? Making the cup of coffee to putting on one's shoes and heading out the door. And in some cases, layering different contexts together, talking on the phone while tying one's shoes, and so on and so forth. What this work shows us is that the ability to task switch and context switch, that is to shift around what it is that we're paying attention to and interleave different things that we're paying attention to, something that's so critical for moving through our daily lives, is largely dependent on the dopamine projections to a structure in the brain called the basal ganglia, which is a structure I've talked about before on this podcast, but if you didn't hear about it, we can just broadly define this structure as being involved in movement generation and stopping movement generation. In fact, it's often discussed as the neural circuitry that generates go, as in do commands, and no-go, don't do commands. So the basal ganglia are involved in task switching, and they are involved in task switching in part by sending certain commands to go, do certain things, and no-go to not do other things. Okay, task switching. Stop doing this, start doing that. Start doing that, stop doing this. And sometimes to varying extents, right? I mean, we could take any real world scenario of tying on shoes while talking on the phone, and we could microanalyze it in the context of this. But I think if you think about it just a little bit, you understand that in order to perform daily tasks, we need to be able to task switch. And that's not always a start one task, end. Start a new task, end. Oftentimes we're interleaving different tasks to varying degrees. Now, the other aspect of working memory and attention is to eliminate distractions, to not pay attention to the irrelevant stuff in one's environment, or even the irrelevant stuff on your own body. Like you can't get distracted by, a button that, might be only partially buttoned, or maybe some little something on your sleeve if you're trying to do something else at that moment. Okay, and people with ADHD and people who have subclinical challenges and focus really have a hard time with this, right? The sort of stereotype is, oh, look, a squirrel, that whole thing. But really this typically exists as a more subtle and challenging phenomenon for people where they either can't remember what they were doing, or they're simply drawn down different trajectories, different thought trajectories or action trajectories, and then they have a hard time making it back to the original thing that they were trying to focus on. And we know, based on these studies of dopamine and neuroimaging, that eliminating distractors is largely the consequence of dopamine neurons projecting to the prefrontal cortex. Okay, now why am I telling you all this neural circuitry stuff? Well, yes, there are a bunch of studies showing that if you selectively activate the neurons that send dopamine into the basal ganglia, you improve task switching ability without an improved ability to rule out distractors. Or if you selectively increase the amount of dopamine from neurons projecting the prefrontal cortex, that you're able to selectively improve the elimination of distractors without improving task switching ability. For practical purposes, in this discussion, we want to pay careful attention to whether or not the data tell us that those particular protocols, those particular approaches are globally increasing dopamine, that is increasing the activity of dopamine neurons projecting to the basal ganglia and the prefrontal cortex, or selectively to the basal ganglia or selectively to the prefrontal cortex. And what I can tell you now is that fortunately there are several protocols, some of which are behavioral, some of which involve specific over-the-counter supplements, and some of which involve prescription pharmacology, that can tap into each of these systems independently, as well as globally increase dopamine to improve focus and working memory at large. I'd like to take a quick break to acknowledge our sponsor, Element. Element is an electrolyte drink that has everything you need and nothing you don't. That means zero sugar and the appropriate ratios of the electrolytes, sodium, magnesium, and potassium. And that correct ratio of electrolytes is extremely important because every cell in your body, but especially your nerve cells, your neurons, relies on electrolytes in order to function properly. So when you're well hydrated and you have the appropriate amount of electrolytes in your system, your mental functioning and your physical functioning is improved. I drink 1 packet of Element dissolved in about 16 to 32 ounces of water when I wake up in the morning, as well as while I exercise. And if I've sweat a lot during that exercise, I often will drink a 3rd Element packet dissolved in about 32 ounces of water after I exercise. Element comes in a variety of different flavors, all of which I find really tasty. I like the citrus, I like the watermelon, I like the raspberry. Frankly, I can't pick just one. It also comes in chocolate and chocolate mint, which I find taste best if they are put into water, dissolved, and then heated up. I tend to do that in the winter months because, of course, you don't just need hydration on hot days and in the summer and spring months, but also in the winter when the temperatures are cold and the environment tends to be dry. If you'd like to try Element, you can go to drinkelement, spelled lmnt.com/Huberman to try a free sample pack. Again, that's drinkelement.com/Huberman. Okay, so let's talk about protocols to improve working memory, specifically by way of changing levels of dopamine in the brain. Now, I've discussed dopamine many times before on this podcast. In fact, we have entire episodes devoted to optimizing and regulating dopamine. And of course, dopamine comes up within the context of the ADHD episodes and other episodes as well. And again, if you have specific questions about dopamine or any other topic for that matter, if you go to hubermanlab.com, that website has been engineered so that you can put one word, such as dopamine, but also multiple keywords, so perhaps dopamine exercise or dopamine cold plunge, etc., into the search function, and it will take you to the specific timestamps of multiple episodes where those topics were discussed, as well as newsletters where some of that information has been condensed into short PDF form, etc. So we certainly are going to cover some material about improving dopamine for sake of improving working memory now. But if you're generally interested in the science and pharmacology of dopamine and protocols to modulate dopamine levels, all of that can be found at hubermanlab.com. Okay, so let's say you have a short working memory span or a moderate working memory span, and you want to experiment with increasing levels of dopamine for sake of improving working memory. Now, there are a lot of different ways that one could imagine doing that. Let's start with the behavioral tools known to increase dopamine stores. That is, shown in peer-reviewed studies to increase dopamine stores within certain circuits of the brain that are relevant for working memory performance. And the protocol that immediately leaps to mind is the use of certain non-sleep deep rest protocols. Now, non-sleep deep rest, or NSDR, is actually a term that I coined because there is a practice that's been established for many hundreds of years called yoga nidra, which actually means yoga sleep, whereby individuals, potentially you, if you decide to do them, lie down, listen to a script, that is, listen to an audio script, which generally instructs you to do long exhale breathing, to deliberately relax your musculature of your face and of your body. And yoga nidra typically also involves doing certain intentions. And the instruction always given at the beginning of yoga nidra is that you should try to not fall asleep. Now, some people sometimes fall asleep, some people don't fall asleep, but the idea, and there are data to support, that yoga nidra puts people into kind of a shallow pattern of sleep, certainly not deep sleep and not rapid eye movement sleep, but it's a very interesting and unusual brain state for which we're starting to understand more. And actually, I have some plans in the not too distant future to collaborate with Matthew Walker, the author of the book Why We Sleep, and some other colleagues to try and figure out what exact patterns of neural activity are taking place in the brain and rest of nervous system during yoga nidra and this similar protocol, which I call non-sleep deep rest. The difference between yoga nidra and non-sleep deep rest is that non-sleep deep rest doesn't include any of the intentions and removes a lot of the kind of opaque or sometimes called mystical language from the protocol. Now, a great thing is that yoga nidra scripts or protocols, as well as NSDR scripts or protocols, are available totally zero cost. You can find them certainly on apps like Waking Up, but also on YouTube. For instance, if you put NSDR and my last name, there's a 10-minute NSDR script there. There are a lot of yoga nidra scripts. If you prefer a female voice, there are a lot of different excellent female voices out there. One in particular that I like very much is Kelly Boys. First name Kelly, last name Boys. She has both yoga nidra and NSDR scripts of various durations of anywhere from 8 minutes all the way out to, I believe, 45 minutes. Why am I telling you all this? Well, there have been several studies, but in particular one, and I do realize we're talking about only one study, but the results are really intriguing as it relates to what we're talking about today. In this study, they had individuals do effectively an NSDR protocol. They call it yoga nidra, and the protocol they used was essentially a yoga nidra script. They had people lie down and listen to a yoga nidra script and to perform yoga nidra, and they evaluated the amount of dopamine available within the brain both prior to and after performing this yoga nidra script. And what they discovered was that after performing a yoga nidra protocol, the baseline levels of dopamine, that is the amount of dopamine available in the basal ganglia and a few other structures of the human brain, of course these are humans, was increased by as much as 60% as compared to individuals that did a different protocol, not yoga nidra, not NSDR. Now, did that study evaluate lots of different durations of yoga nidra, aka NSDR? No. They looked at fairly long hour-plus yoga nidra sessions. However, there's some other data that have explored yoga nidra, aka NSDR, in the context of cognitive performance and a few other circumstances, all of which point to the fact that cognitive performance, and in particular cognitive performance tasks that have a working memory element to them. So they weren't the exact working memory tasks that you did earlier, but they have a working memory element to them. That is, subjects had to keep certain small batches of information in mind and then discard that information in order to be able to perform the task well. all of those show significant improvements in task performance. So while something like NSDR or Yoga Nidra might sound kind of mystical or kind of, wishy-washy, or I guess as the kids say, weak sauce to some of you, it is anything but weak sauce. It is really powerful stuff. And it's powerful stuff as it relates to the very neurochemicals and neural